Wrigley soap and water. The Wrigley building bears the name of the Wrigley Chewing Gum Company. That is a big Chicago name. It's also the name on Wrigley Field, the baseball stadium just north of it, up Clark Street. Speaking of big names, I bet you'll never guess the name of the building coming up directly behind me. It was built in the year 2009 by a Chicago architect named Adrian Smith. It is, of course, Trump International Hotel and Tower, which is a great example of a more recent architectural style called contextualism. If you look up the side of the tower, you'll see 3 flat patios ascending the building. Those are called setbacks, and each one of these setbacks corresponds with one of the other buildings around Trump Tower. The first setback is the same height as the roof of the Wrigley building underneath its clock tower, which I just mentioned. The second setback corresponds with the height of that skinny rocket ship-looking building off the left-hand side of the boat. That's Mather Tower. And the third setback is the same height as AMA Plaza, a black boxy building, which will start peeking out from behind Trump Tower in just a moment here. If you look directly off the right-hand side of the boat, you'll see a wavy pattern in the first few floors of Trump Tower. That is another contextualist feature that mimics the waves of the Chicago River. So the building is built in context, both with the natural elements around it and with the other buildings that came here before it. Next up on the right-hand side of the boat, peeking out from behind AMA Plaza, we have 2 of the more iconic buildings on this architecture tour. I like to call these towers the corn cobs. Now, their actual name is Marina City, but they kind of look like a pair of corn cobs. That's a funny nickname, which is going to be a motif on this architecture tour. If we like your building here in Chicago, we might give it a funny nickname. Some artists and architects really enjoy this. Some really don't. I know that Anish Kapoor, the designer of the Cloud Gate sculpture down at Millennium Park, really hates it when we here in Chicago call it the bean. But it looks like a bean, so we're going to keep calling it that because we think it's cute. Now, coming back to Marina City, these towers were not actually designed to look like a pair of corn cobs. They were designed more with sunflowers in mind. Around the outside of the towers, you have balconies. Those come from apartments that all start pretty narrow at the door, and they flare out into that pedal shape around the outside of the buildings. Underneath those balconies, that pedal shape continues, but it becomes valet-only parking. It is valet-only because if you are not very, very careful, you might drive your car into the river, which has happened twice. Once in a Steve McQueen film called The Hunter, and again in a car insurance commercial that was referencing that movie. Underneath that parking structure, you've got things like a steakhouse, they've got a seafood joint, there's a bowling alley in there, and underneath it all, a place for you to park your yacht. Truly, it's a city within a city. Everything you could possibly need in one location. Marina City was built in the 1960s by a man named Bertram Goldberg, and it was a bit of a social experiment to see if Bertram Goldberg could convince people to come back and live here along the Chicago River. There were not a lot of people living along the river in the 60s because the Chicago River was very, very dirty, had been for decades. But that started to change. In the year 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act. From that time forward, the river has been getting cleaner and cleaner, and nicer and nicer. At the time of the passage of the Clean Water Act, there were only 7 species of fish found living in the Chicago River. Today, there are over 70. You see all sorts of different birds out here, from ducks up to cranes and herons. And just last year, we found a massive snapping turtle living up the north branch of the Chicago River. Chicagoans named him Chonkosaurus. So there's another funny nickname for you. Now, as the river has gotten cleaner and nicer, folks have wanted to spend more time out here. Directly off the left-hand side of the boat, you'll see a section of the Chicago Riverwalk, which was designed in the year 1909. We only started building it at the turn of the millennium, and it was completed in 2016. It's a great example of Chicago continuing to work on itself and improve itself over time. Another great example of Chicago moving through time is this building off the left-hand side of the boat. It kind of looks like 2 buildings smashed together. It's got a black dividing line that runs down the length of it. That's the Builders Building, originally home to some architectural firms, and it was constructed in 2 different decades. The first section that we'll pass on the left-hand side is from the 1920s, and it is our first example of Art Deco architecture on the tour. Some elements of Art Deco architecture include deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward, and a repeated machine-cut patterning around the outside of the building. But after that black dividing line, that repeated machine-cut patterning goes away. That is a postmodern section of the building from the 1980s. But it respects the same line established by the Art Deco section from the 20s that came before it. It's a great example of how architects speak to each other in concert down through the decades. Now, having just introduced you to Art Deco architecture, you'll see a much more massive example of it coming up on the right-hand side of the boat. This next building is the Merchandise Mart. Now, you'll see the same Art Deco elements that I mentioned just a moment ago. It's got deep inset windows, long vertical lines, and repeated machine-cut patterning. But what you'll probably notice right now is the credits rolling from a giant public art show that we have out here. This is called Art on the Mart. It is free to come out and watch along the Chicago Riverwalk starting at 7:30 p.m. Thursdays through Sundays. After it wraps up here, it should start over again. It repeats a couple of different times for about half an hour until 8 o'clock. Now that art show is projected from that little glass case directly off the left-hand side of the boat that's filled with LED projectors. And as those LEDs are shining onto the side of the Merchandise Mart, they're so carefully calibrated that all of that light is hitting only the walls. None of it is spilling in the windows. So if there's anyone working late inside that building, they might not have even noticed that there's a giant public art show going on just outside their window. As we finish passing the Merchandise Mart, we are headed into an area of the river known as Wolf Point. This is where the main branch of the Chicago River, which we've been on so far, meets the North Branch, which runs up to the right, and the South Branch, which heads down to the left. Nowadays, Wolf Point is a modern focal area of contextualist architecture. We are surrounded by shiny glass towers, each one reflecting the others around it, so that it looks like we're at the bottom of a glass canyon. Now this tower directly behind me, with the archway cut out of the bottom, and another arch cut out of the top, kind of makes it look like a giant Hot Pocket, or a deodorant stick. I had one kid once tell me that it looks like a McDonald's apple pie. But that's River Point Tower, standing where the old Wolf Point Tavern used to be. The Wolf Point Tavern was the original heart of the city of Chicago, where the city really started to sprout up. Because of course, everyone comes to the tavern after work. So this area is also where Chicago got many of its first businesses, its first school, and its very first theater. It is a great meeting place of Chicago's history and its modern contextualist architecture. Actually, if you take a look directly off the right-hand side of the boat at the fence that runs along the Chicago Riverwalk, you may be able to make out a repeated Y shape that is built into that fence line. That is a municipal device of the city of Chicago, representing the 3 branches of the river coming together here at Wolf Point. Once you notice that symbol, you'll start to see it all over town, sort of like Chicago's version of a hidden Mickey at Disneyland. Now, as we make our turn up the north branch of the Chicago River, I'm going to keep us in the distant past. We're going to talk a bit about the oldest building that you can see today on this architecture tour. That is that pink brick building coming up directly behind me. We'll end up passing it off the left-hand side of the boat. Fulton House, from the year 1898. Nowadays, Fulton House is mainly condominiums, but originally this building was part of one of Chicago's first major industries. That would be the meat packing industry. If you look up at the balconies around the outside of Fulton House, you'll see that in some places the walls are up to 4 feet thick. When they cut into this building to renovate it in the 1970s, they found those walls stuffed full of cork, sawdust, and horsehair, which is what they were using as insulation, because this was basically a giant icebox used to store meat and keep it cool before shipping it out all over the country on refrigerated train cars. They had to wait for about 6 months for this building to fully thaw out before they could finish those renovations in the 1970s. The renovations of Fulton House were done by an architect named Harry Weiss. People thought Harry Weiss was a little bit nuts. This was just after the passage of the Clean Water Act. People still thought, who would want to come down here and live along the old, polluted Chicago River? Well, Harry Weiss got the last laugh. He is also responsible for this next building off the left-hand side of the boat, the river cottages, with the triangle pattern built into the roofs. The most recent of these river cottages to sell went for $2.25 million, because nowadays people really enjoy living down here along the scenic, wildlife-filled Chicago River. Harry Weiss loved a nautical theme in his work. The triangle pattern in the roof of the river cottages is meant to evoke the sails on a tall-masted sailing ship. Now we are heading into a more residential area of the Chicago River. After we pass underneath the Kinsey Street Bridge, off the left-hand side of the boat, you'll be able to see the Kinsey Street townhomes, which also sell for just about $2 million. And once you have paid $2 million for your lovely Kinsey Street townhome, what you do not want to be hearing constantly is my voice blaring at you from the speakers on this boat. So in just a moment, as we get ready to turn the boat around and head back towards Wolf Point, I'm going to jump off the microphone and get myself a drink of water. That was a great time for you to get yourself a drink downstairs with Zach at the bar if you would like, or use the back rooms if you need to. If you have any questions, I'll take a little walk around the boat and I can attempt to answer them now. And I will jump back on the mic as we head back towards Wolf Point and the south branch of the Chicago River, picking up with that raised drawbridge that we passed underneath. Don't worry, I did not completely ignore the most obvious, interesting thing that we passed by so far. Just need to leave myself something to talk about as we head back the other way. I will see you all in just a moment. As we start to head back underneath the Kinsey Street Bridge, this is a great opportunity to talk about these bridges along the Chicago River. These are all drawbridges. They're called trunnion and bascule style bridges. Some of them open from one side, some of them open from the middle. I've got this old railway bridge off the left-hand side of the boat that we leave in that raised position, and you can see why. It would be coming down at the landing pad off the right-hand side of the boat, taking our heads clean off at the shoulders. So we leave that old bridge up like that. I have heard that railway bridge does still descend once per year, so a truck can drive across it and back again. They'll do some maintenance on it, and it can still be listed as active for government purposes, we are very proud of all 37 movable bridges that we have here in the city of Chicago. But while these are all drawbridges, they do not raise and lower very often. And that is because that quickly snarls traffic in and out of downtown. You may have just noticed the L train going over the Lake Street Bridge behind me there. You can imagine that gets pretty backed up when we have to raise these bridges. So most of the boats that traverse the Chicago River, like ours, are built to fit underneath the bridges without having to lift them. There are a few days per year that we designate as bridge lift days, where anyone who owns a tall-masted sailboat can get their boat out to Lake Michigan when the weather gets nice, and back in for storage when the weather gets crummy again in the autumn. On those mornings, usually pretty early, those boats will group together, they'll make their way up and down the Chicago River, lifting these bridges one by one, and those of us that work downtown have to figure out how we're going to get into work that day, because it does make things a little bit dicey traffic-wise. Now, earlier I mentioned River Point Tower, now off the right-hand side of the boat, standing where the old Wolf Point Tavern used to be. This archway at the base of River Point Tower is a contextualist feature, mimicking the curve here of the Chicago River at Wolf Point. It is also structural, dividing the weight of this building around the train lines that run underneath it. That's what those circles underneath River Point Tower are, vents from the train lines that run below the building. The next glass tower off the right-hand side of the boat kind of looks like a giant upside-down mechanical pencil. That is 150 North Riverside. It cuts in at the back to avoid the train lines that run behind it, and it cuts in at the front to leave a 30-foot gap in between the riverbank and its front door. And that is part of a modern Chicago zoning law that requires 30 feet from the river to the entrance of the more recent contextualist towers along the Chicago River, so that we can enjoy heading out along the Chicago Riverwalk on a lovely autumn evening like this. But that does make a building like 150 North Riverside kind of precariously balanced. And all of the skyscrapers here in Chicago have to be built to withstand what is known as wind drift, the force of the wind on a skyscraper. If you look directly off the right-hand side of the boat, you'll see the massive concrete pillars that 150 North Riverside balances on top of. Those drive all the way down into the bedrock underneath the building, anchoring it in place. Up towards the top of 150 North Riverside, inside the building, is something called inertial slosh dampers, which is a fancy name for giant tanks of 160,000 gallons of water. So that when the wind blows one way on the building, the water naturally sloshes in the other direction, keeping the building stable. I think that is a fascinating engineering solve, and also I really just enjoy saying inertial slosh dampers. It's fun to say. It sounds like something out of a Doctor Who episode, or Star Trek, speaking of busted time travel adventures. Now our next contextualist glass tower off the left-hand side of the boat is Bank of America Tower. You'll see it has a different method of respecting that 30-foot gap that it's required to have from the river to its entrance. The top floors of this building are all balanced on these three-part struts, anchoring it to the riverbank. That leaves room underneath for that cutout, where you have shops, cafes, and some lovely public space to hang out along the Chicago River. Bank of America Tower is also notable for being one of the few skyscrapers in downtown Chicago with no residential space. This building is entirely made up of office space. It was completed in November of 2020, which is a perfect time to build a brand spanking new office building in downtown Chicago, just as the pandemic sends everyone home. This would be kind of like building a brand new Art Deco office building in downtown Chicago in the year 1929, just before the stock market crash. Speaking of which, that's unfortunately exactly what happened to this building off the right-hand side of the boat. This is number 2 North Riverside. You'll see those same Art Deco elements that I mentioned earlier, deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward. The machine-cut patterning around the outside of this building tells the story of the printed word, from papyrus in ancient Egypt with these obelisks along the riverbank, up through the Gutenberg printing press, all the way to modern-day newspapers, because this was originally the home of the Chicago Daily News. But after the stock market crash in 1929, the United States goes straight into the Great Depression, and then immediately into World War II. For about 25 years, no one was really building big new buildings in downtown Chicago. When we got back to it in the 50s and 60s, styles and attitudes had changed. People didn't have time for all that fancy art deco anything anymore. They wanted something simple, something practical. And we get to the advent of black box modernism, typified by gateway number 1 and gateway number 2, these big black cubes off the right-hand side of the boat. Black box modernism was a style pioneered by a man named Mies van der Rohe. You may be familiar with the expression that he popularized: less is more. Mies van der Rohe firmly believed that form follows function. So, what is the function of an office building? Well, it has to have space inside it for a whole bunch of cubicles. So, by moving the steel supports to the outside of the building and leaving them exposed, you free up space inside for those cubicles to be stacked ever closer together, turning a whole bunch of little cubes into one giant cube. This is also going to be a great opportunity to look directly underneath gateway number 2, and you can see the train lines that run underneath this building. The train companies own all of the land along this bank of the river leading up towards Union Station. The towers built on top of the tracks lease their air rights from the train companies underneath them. Moving ahead into the 1970s, people thought, okay, black box modernism, that was a good idea, but it's a little bit dour if you do it all the time, so what if we make them brighter now instead? This white tower off the right-hand side of the boat is gateway number 3. We are getting very creative with the names of our buildings along this part of the Chicago River. Gateway number 3 is a great example of something called international style, because buildings that look like this started to pop up all over the world in the 1970s. It is functionally the same as a black box modernist building. You've covered those exposed steel supports in that white siding, which also makes the building cheaper to cool in the summer, because that white siding reflects heat. Jumping ahead again into the 1980s, we get to the dawn of contextualism. This shinier glass tower off the right-hand side of the boat is, of course, gateway number 4. But you can see those contextualist features that I mentioned earlier. The glass is more reflective, and there is a curve down the middle of the building, representing the curve here of the Chicago River, which you can also see represented on the giant map off the left-hand side of the boat that is plastered onto the side of 300 South Wacker. One of the things I like about this map is that it